First, we'll need to create a WSFederation supporting security token service. Let's start with an empty web project. Let's name it tripcompany.wsfederation server. This should be an empty web project without any form of authentication enabled. Then let's install the microsoft.owin.host.system web package so it can act as an Owin host. And now we can add a startup class. So far for that. There's a package available to help us with setting this up. It's the identity server.windows authentication package. Let's install that. What this adds is the ability to have this web application act as a WSFederation security token service, authenticating with Windows authentication. The next thing we'll have to do is ensure Windows authentication is enabled and make sure this web app runs on HTTPS and starts up on HTTPS. That's something we've done before when setting up the STS. Let's start with enabling Windows authentication. We can do that in the properties window of the tripcompany.wsfederation server. If you find that this is grayed out on your machine, that means local IIS Express doesn't allow Windows authentication. You can change that. We can do that by opening the application host.config file, which configures your IIS Express. You can find that in your Documents folder, IIS Express config. Let's open that. You'll want to look for the Security Authentication section group. This is where you'll want to ensure Windows Authentication's override default mode is set to allow. The default setting is no Windows Authentication, and this field is by default set to deny. If this field is set to deny, we can't override the setting in our project properties. So make sure override mode default is set to allow. Then we need to enable SSL and ensure when we start up the application, it starts up at this URI. We do that by setting the project URL to the HTTPS address. And that's it for the plumbing. Let's go to the startup class again. There's a few things I need to do here before we can make this work. I'll have to add a reference to the Trip Gallery Constants project. That's one. Now let's run through this configuration method. We call app.useWindows authentication service coming from the helper package we just installed. The IDP realm value here must match what we will use at ID server level. You can choose this. The reply URL is the URL at ID server where the tokens will be delivered to. This is one we can choose, but it shouldn't exist already at ID server level to ensure it won't interfere with other functionality. I like to set it to WAS or Windows Authentication Service. Public origin is the URI from which this security token service will be made available. That's the URI of our tripcompany.wsfederation server. And then we'll also need a signing certificate, just as we needed when we configured identity server. In a real-life situation, you'll want to buy a certificate for this or generate one. For demo purposes, we can use the same identity server 3 test certificate we used when configuring identity server. Let me add that. And there we go. With this piece of code, we have already set up a standard WSFederation enabled security token service with Windows Authentication enabled. Let's test that one. And what we see here is the WSFederation metadata. So this seems to work. However, we're not done yet. We're going to need to do one more thing. The external provider must be able to be linked to an existing account. Otherwise, when a user uses Windows Authentication, he'll end up creating a new account, not being linked to an existing one. That might be okay for your situation, it really depends on your requirements. But for our case, I'd like this user, which is my Windows user, to be linked to my existing account. There's a way to do this. We can do claims transformation at this level by providing a custom claims provider, which must implement the iCustom Claims Provider interface. So let's add such a service. Let's name it Additional Windows Claims Provider. The iCustom Claims Provider interface contains one method, transform async, which allows us to transform the claims identity. Now, if you're on a domain using your company's Active Directory, chances are you'll have access to that email address linked to your user's Windows identity. I don't have that on my local machine, so I'll have to add the email address hard-coded. If you're going to use this in a production environment, you're going to either need to get the information to link logins to accounts from a mapping table, or more realistically, from your company's Active Directory. The context contains both the incoming Windows principal and the outgoing subject from which a token will be created. What we want to do is add an email claim when that outgoing subject's claim matches my Windows identity. Now let's make sure we use this additional Windows claims provider. And that should be it. We've now got a WSFederation supporting security token service that uses Windows Authentication to sign into it. And we also make sure we've got an email address we can match to from our identity server security token service. And we've also made sure we now have a way to match this Windows user to an existing user in our user store. On to identity server. To enable a WSFederation external identity provider, we'll want to install the microsoft.owen.security.wsfederation package. And then let's configure it. Authentication type is something we choose, Windows in our case. Caption is what will be shown on the button we'll see at identity server level. The sign-in as authentication type parameter should match the parameter we get passed in the configure additional identity providers method. The metadata address, well, that matches the address of our WSFederation server. And the realm, that should match what we put in at that level, URN win. This is the basic configuration we'll need. But for your information, a lot more is possible. Just like, for example, the OpenID Connect middleware we use at MVC level, we can also subscribe to notifications in which we can do additional claims transformation and so on. We're not going to go into that here, but if you need it, you already know the principles from the previous modules. Let's give this a try. I'm going to put a breakpoint in the authenticate external async method so we can see what we get back. Then let's ensure we start up the WSFederation server as well. And let's run. We now get an extra button here, Windows. Let's try that. And we're in our authenticate external async method. Notice that I wasn't asked to provide any credentials. That's the Windows authentication at the level of the WSFederation server at work. We hit the breakpoint, so let's see what's in the context. Well, that indeed looks like my Windows user. And we've even got that additional email claim we added. Let's continue. And there we go. We see all the trips we should see when logging in with my user account, but this time we've used Windows authentication for this. That login provider has now been linked to my current account. So from this moment on, I can log in using my self-chosen username password, or my Facebook credentials, or my Windows credentials. But what would have happened if we couldn't match this external provider to an existing user? We'd end up in the code to create a new user, which would then go and find the given name and family name if we'd log in using Facebook as an external identity provider. But we don't have those claims. We got them back from Facebook, but we don't get them back when using Windows authentication currently. We could add them as claims at the level of our WSFederation STS, but sooner or later you'll hit a situation where you'll want the user to provide additional information that isn't available at the level of the external provider. How can we do that? What we need to do is redirect the user to a page so he can provide us with information we need. This can be done thanks to the partial login functionality exposed by Identity Server. Let's look into that in the next demo.